Today, we are interviewing Richie Venton, the national workplace organizer for the Scottish Socialist Party, who recently released this publication called Socialist Change, Not Climate Change. Thank you, Richie, for joining us today.
Hello.
How are you? Have you been enjoying these last days at COP26?
Yes, it's been very interesting to see a whole multitude of people from different nationalities and origins coming into the city and making their voices very loud and clear. But they need to take emergency action to stop this climate catastrophe. So it's very encouraging, uh, including the fact that a lot of people are very young, but also a lot of veterans are still fighting on. And that definitely does boost you when you've spent a lifetime trying to change the world that you live in.
Right. And you actually found that many older people joined these movement, not just the marches, but
Mhm.
also the movements, also the activism. Did you find that?
Yes, I think it's a mix, definitely. There is a huge proportion are young people. That in itself is number one understandable, because I saw a survey that 72% of young people are scared that the planet will not survive during their lifetime. And of course, the response of the Tory government of Westminster is to initiate new measures to punish them if they dare to leave school in protest and to fine the parents for allowing them to do so. That's their answer, repression. But it's understandable that young people are motivated and driven by a desire to stop this catastrophe, which they perceive as the end of the world during their lifetime. That is also reflected in the numbers of young people that have joined the demonstrations in particular. But I think it was pleasing as well that it's multi-generational, that a lot of older people, pensioners included, from different countries actually, that I encountered on the monsoon demonstration in particular on the Saturday, that people of all generations have come together, and as I said, all nationalities and creed or otherwise. So it's a mass movement. And of course, my desire is that it doesn't just evaporate on the 12th or 13th of November. Of course, you cannot keep up that intensity, but you need to have a consciousness of the issues sustained and then action to change the society that's created that. Because, I mean, the COP26 itself, it's a gathering of the big polluters. The fact that 71% of all pollution since 1988 is the responsibility of 100 big companies, and actually currently 50 companies account for over half of the world's emissions. That is an indication of the concentrated blame in the multinationals and the big polluters and the banks that finance them. So the polluters are not going to cause a solution to pollution, which they created in the first place. And it's a case more of relying on that issue being made centre stage in the consciousness of the mass of the population, and then trying to put across ideas whereby people would gain by action against climate change, rather than some kind of prospectus of having to live in hair shorts and suffer and lose jobs and be in dire poverty. That's not the message that's required, and it's totally unnecessary as well. You can both have good jobs and clean air. In fact, I'd argue that the only way to be able to breathe clean air is by taking steps that create good jobs in order to, in a sense, reindustrialise places like Scotland and elsewhere on a green basis.
Very good. Thank you. And so, Richie, we'd like to ask you about this publication. Can you please explain a little more about the reasons behind it?
Well, we thought in the Scottish Socialist Party that it was necessary to try and bring a different kind of voice to the proceedings at COP26, not in the chambers of the heads of state and the capitalist polluters. We didn't get very close to that. Nobody did. But amongst the people who are protesting, because we really do admire and salute the revolt of young people, the Fridays for Future movement, the strikes they've taken, and so on. And very importantly, the way in which the attitude of those young school students included has changed in the last couple of years. In the past, they tended to focus a lot on, if you like, improved personal behaviour, or almost like guilt tripping the older generation for having created this mess. Well, as far as I'm concerned, climate change is not a generational issue, it's a class issue. And we wanted to bring class politics and class solutions in the sense that something that's based on the vast majority of the population who are working class people of one kind of occupation or another, solutions that would tackle both pollution and poverty in shorthand. And so we decided to produce what became a small book, a booklet, originally a pamphlet, I suppose. We did that in order to try and do a number of things. One was to identify the scale of the crisis, so as to ensure that people really do understand just how critical the climate issue is, because up until recently at least, it was unfortunate there was only a minority, for example, of trade union activists who really saw this as a big issue. And then on the other hand, only a tiny minority of the climate activists had the attitude that trade unions and workers' organisations were a central part of the solution. So we've tried to blend the two, marry the two, and put across the idea that there is a catastrophic level of system crisis in terms of climate, but also economic crisis, and then to identify the causes in order to in turn identify potential solutions, and very importantly to try and point towards the agencies of change, what forces, what social forces, what class power is required in order to bring about a change that would save the planet and people's livelihoods. So that's the purpose of writing it. Others can be the judge of whether we succeeded, but hopefully. And trying to illustrate with current and historical examples of the power that working class people have if they combine and when they're motivated to do so on the basis of clear-cut aims. I mean, in the book I've referred to examples like the Green Bands movement in Australia, or the power of the indigenous people in North America that stopped the equivalent of something like a quarter of all North America's emissions through their actions in the last decade. The potential power of workers illustrated in this area by, it's gone back a few years, 50 years, but the Upper Clyde shipbuilding work-in, where it was a glimpse of a future that could be, where the working class controlled things. And if we had a society based on public ownership and then a series of measures to tackle pollution and poverty, I think we'd have a different world and save the planet in that sense. So we put forward a number of things in the book, such as elaborate on the policies of free public transport as a means of cutting pollution, poverty and social isolation, provision of clean green energy by removing ownership from the big six and other polluting energy giants that rip the profit out of you, as they're doing this winter, for example, with their price increases. And also public ownership of construction, so as to provide ecologically sound homes for affordable rent through councils and local housing associations, instead of people seeing the heat escape through their windies, as they say in Scotland and Northern Ireland, and through the roofs and the walls and so on, because most of the houses in this country are over 100 years old and they don't have cavities, for example, for insulation, and they were built to leak the heat from open fires. So it's concrete measures we've put across in this publication, so people can relate to it and see, yes, it would create hundreds of thousands of new jobs just in Scotland alone. And then, of course, we'd seek to build alliances with people abroad to transpose the same methods elsewhere.
Very good. Thank you. And speaking of politics, across the last few days within the various COP26 coalition events, we have to pick up on a particular keyword that has been referred to: accountability. In terms of accountability for people who are in power and they don't deliver what they promise. What do you think about this? How can we achieve this?
It's related to the previous points, I suppose, because I think a lot of them are quite accountable, but to the wrong people. They're accountable to the fossil fuel companies, for example. It's not an accident that, just to take one case, some of the American politicians over decades deliberately helped to cover up the reports from scientists, including scientists on the payroll of fossil fuel companies, actually, about the threat to the planet and the crisis of climate change that was looming way back, at least since the 1970s, and in some respects before that. And they consciously cover up, as I put it in a chapter heading, this big oil, big lies. And the politicians were instrumental in that. And right now they're also lending their ear to the lobbies of those same polluting multinationals. Not just fossil fuel, others as well, but that's a key example. Or the fact that these politicians are engaged in almost perpetual war. And war and military movements is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, cause of pollution. And so therefore, the very fact that up the road on the banks of the Clyde, we have nuclear weapons parked under the control of America in order allegedly to protect us. As I've often said, presumably we can feel safe with nuclear weapons to protect our food banks in Scotland. Then you've got the movement of military, which causes pollution overseas and by air and so on. So the fact we live in a world where the politicians are at war with each other for capitalist markets and for a share of the market, they're accountable to the profiteers, I think is the starting point of the problem. But to take it probably in the way that you meant and that most people are concerned about, I think there is a real problem of politicians being held accountable by the ordinary people, because in the main there's no mechanism for it. I would argue that, for example, one step in the right direction is that no politician should live on anything above the average skilled worker's wage in the country that they represent or the people they represent. That would make them more accountable in their heads, because any time workers were fighting for an improved wage, they'd have a vested interest in supporting them instead of being on the wrong side. Or another measure would be that a certain proportion of the population could petition for them to be removed and to have a by-election. But I suppose it goes deeper still, Manlio, because for me it's a case of who controls day-to-day society. And when the SSP advocates public ownership of all forms of energy, public transport, construction, the banking system that currently finances fossil fuel, etc., in order to have a clean, green reindustrialization of the country, to create tens of thousands, in fact, estimates of at least 350,000 new jobs over a decade, then when we argue for that, it doesn't stop there, because you'd also need democratic control of those public institutions of energy, a state energy company or public transport service or whatever you're talking about, the health service currently, for example. And I believe it should be based on the idea that the boards of management should be elected from some kind of combination of workplace representatives through their unions, the wider population, local elected councillors perhaps, if it's appropriate, such as in transport, or the health service perhaps, and the national government, but that there be a working class majority and that they should be elected and recallable. They could be replaced. That would be a form of workplace and societal democracy that's not really been tested in the modern age, certainly in an advanced country anyway. And therefore, it's something that would transform the relationship between representatives and the people. So instead of having these professional politicians who are held accountable or make themselves available to big business and the bankers and the polluters, we could have representatives from communities, from workplaces, from wider society, who are held accountable and on the same incomes as the people representing them. So I think that's the kind of transformation that's required to overcome this problem, which actually has caused, or is one of the causes, of the rise of the far right across Europe and beyond, where people are disgusted by the mainstream politicians, social democratic politicians included, the equivalent of Scottish Labour, for example, and turn for solutions. And unfortunately, not all of them turn towards socialist solutions, because the bigger media coverage tends to be for far-right demagogy that sounds like an easy answer. Blame the other, blame the foreigners, blame the people of a different religion or a different creed or a different colour. That's the kind of poison that this unaccountable political elite helps to create. Throughout COP26, the Scottish Socialist Party has applied our fundamental principle that we're on the side of the working class majority, not in words, in practice. So, for example, I would go down to an early morning picket line of the cleansing workers and sometimes be invited to speak as well as just chatting to them, but to address the pickets and to convey solidarity, not just from our party, but from the wider trade union movement, as the coordinator of what's called the Scottish Workers' Solidarity Network, which is multi-union, multi-party. And then go to demonstrations by climate activists and try to convey the importance of linking their struggles with those of cleansing workers, railway workers who are continuing to be in action, because the sleeper service will be out on strike again this week for a pay rise as opposed to the pay cuts they've suffered. Or other sections of workers, whoever they might be, including the women primarily in Glasgow City Council, who are preparing again for industrial action in pursuit of equal pay. Over 50 years after the Equal Pay Act was passed in 1970, women had to take strike action in 2018 to get a Labour and then an SNP council in turn to implement equal pay, and they're still not applying it. So they're now starting another industrial ballot for action. And so we're on their side. And for example, last night we held a Scottish Socialist Party public meeting on the theme of winning a socialist Green New Deal, which is the essence or slogan that I've coined to describe what we put forward instead of climate crisis and economic crisis for working class people. So we had a public meeting with a platform of workers in struggle. We had somebody from the Serco Caledonian Sleeper Service, the leading RMT member. We had Chris Mitchell, the convener of the cleansing workers. We had Shona from the Women Fighting for Equal Pay. We had the General Secretary of the Bakers Union, Sarah Woolley. And what I'm putting across here is that the struggle for better conditions doesn't stop during COP26 nor after it. It's all part of the same thing. And so the Scottish Socialist Party will continue, to use a phrase, luta continua, and we will continue to indulge in struggle, solidarity and socialism, not just during but beyond COP26. Because when the caravan of COP26 delegates moves on, people's conditions, their life prospects and the climate they're living in, the air they breathe, is still there to be tackled. You've still got cleansing workers who are living in buildings unfit for human habitation with rat infestation. That's why they're having their breaks, their lunch, after picking up rubbish all day as a job. So they shouldn't have to eat amongst rubbish as well as pick it up as their job, or the way in which low pay is the curse of the modern working class. So we've been there in the demonstrations, but trying to put across this combined message of workers' struggle and climate struggle for a socialist Green New Deal that would enhance the lives of everybody.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to meet you, Richie, and good luck for the future.